we're going to look at other types of research in psychology. Specifically today, we're going to focus on what's called correlational research. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about the statistics that we can gather from our research in psychology and what that ends up looking like and why we need to know statistics, why statistics even matter to psychology, and kind of their impact as a whole. So we're going to go ahead and start with this concept of correlational research. And the purpose of doing correlational research, as opposed to experimental research, is to determine how two variables are associated with each other, or two or more variables, really. You could do correlational research with more than two variables, but it can get a little complex if you do. And you want to see the degree, how strongly related are these two. One of the keys, the biggest difference, and many would argue that this is a downside. Well, the biggest difference between correlational and experimental research is that researchers don't directly manipulate variables. There is no increasing of X in order to see its effect on Y. That's experimenting. In correlation, we observe naturally occurring differences. And if we see relationship between two variables, then we know that they are correlated, that they have some form of relationship. But it's important to remember that correlation does not prove causation, and that is the biggest downfall to correlational research. Because we are not manipulating variables, we don't have a control group, we can never prove causation. And we cannot say for sure if increased stress around the home leads to lower performance at school, because there could be other factors. So we observe things, but until we have a control group through an experiment, we can never prove causation. But correlational research is nonetheless very valuable in psychology. One of the other things to be aware of in correlational research, and we'll talk a lot more about each of these in depth, is that unknown factors can sometimes play a role. And this is called a confounding, or a third variable. And third variable is sort of a misnomer because sometimes there are more than multiple variables being observed. But for example, if we were taking the previous statement of stress at home leading to low performance at school, there could be other variables that are confounding. You could have lack of supplies at a school. You could have poor teachers. You could have different levels of education. You could have lack of internet at home. You could have lower skill sets. So all of those could be confounding variables that may lead us to believe that there is a correlation between stress at home and at school, but we can never really tell for sure. The nice thing about correlation and correlational research is we can gather information through surveys, which allows us to have a much larger data set. We can get much more information than we can in an experiment. If you tried to run an experiment with 100,000 people, that would be really hard and really time consuming. Think about the amount of time you have to spend with each person as a researcher. If you even spent 1 minute, you're at 100,000 minutes, which is some amount of hours I don't even want to bother to calculate. Too much. But if you gather surveys, then it's on the responders to take the time to fill it out, and you as a researcher just compile the data. This makes it useful for large data sets, large groups of people. It also makes it a lot less expensive because the man hours that go into it are significantly less. It's easier to conduct, and it doesn't take as much time, as I mentioned before. So there are a lot of value to and upsides to doing correlational research because it allows us to kind of widen the scope of what psychologists can study. We're not limited by any ethics or moral dilemmas as we might in certain experiments if we tried to run those. But we are able to kind of see more things and gather more information. And the more information we have is always better. That's just a general rule of thumb. So there are kind of three main types of correlational research. The first is what's known as a naturalistic observation. And in naturalistic observation, researchers just seriously observe what's occurring around them. And this is really useful because we can gain information from a natural environment. We're not in a sterilized lab situation. And in lab situations and in experiments, sometimes people act differently because they know they're being watched. They know that certain things are expected of them. And so that artificial environment could affect the outcome of those experiments, of that information gathering that we're doing. So in naturalistic observations, we can just watch people exist and we can gather that information. And that's really important because life doesn't happen in a bubble. Life doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so if we try to study things in a vacuum, a lot of times we're missing out on other factors and other things that are affecting the world. So it's really important to use sometimes naturalistic observations. Now, one of the problems of naturalistic observations is oftentimes it's really difficult to make those observations without getting in the way or without it being obvious what you're doing. And this can sometimes cause subjects to change their behavior, much like a controlled experimental environment could. And this change of behavior during a naturalistic observation is what we call reactivity. The subjects are reacting to the presence of a researcher, observing them and observing whatever it is they might be doing. And so they may change their habits. But naturalistic observations are very useful in psychology. Another thing is case studies. And in a case study, you do a very in-depth investigation and analysis of a individual subject, individual study, or sometimes like 2 or 3. But generally a case study is just one. And case studies are really useful for investigating some types of phenomena, especially clinical psychology. That's where it's most useful, is if this person is suffering from schizophrenia or what have you, then what is going on? Let's do a case study on schizophrenia. Or if this child is becoming suicidal, let's do a case study on that. And what are the factors that are contributing to this? And if we have an in-depth understanding of the factors that are causing suicidal thoughts in a single person, then we can apply that to other similar cases. So by really getting one willing subject and diving deep, we can explore their thoughts and their feelings and their emotions. We can analyze their biology. We can figure out what's happening in their brain, what's happening with their chemicals. And once we have all of that data, and with just focusing on one person, you can really get a ton of specific data on that person. We can then apply that to other people. This is oftentimes used in clusters. So if we have 3 different 15-year-olds who are all suicidal, boys who are all football players, let's all take a look at, really dig into that. And then we can possibly analyze what causes teenage boys who play football to be suicidal. And then we can apply that to other similar cases. Now, the downsides to case study, and that is really, that's very valuable. Case studies are valuable for that. The downsides is that sometimes they're not representative of a larger population. Now, not all 15-year-old boys play football. So the causes or the underlying concerns that lead to suicide in them may not be the same for 15-year-old boys who play lacrosse or tennis or golf or 15-year-old girls. So we have to really be careful where we apply and how we apply case studies. And that gets to one of the other issues that can sometimes undercut case studies, and that is that they tend to be very subjective. How researchers view their lens that they're coming through really kind of affects the case study that is being looked at, and it affects the application of that to other people. So it's very important to use case studies, but use them very cautiously and make sure that you're using them in the correct scenarios. One other type of correlational research is surveys. And what happens is in surveys, this is relatively straightforward, right? Researchers send out surveys or questionnaires or various other things, and in return, they get that information. Surveys are incredibly useful for gathering information about behavior that can't be observed. So what are you thinking at this time? What are you feeling? Who are you going to vote for? What are you planning to do here? These are internal processes that don't have necessarily overt behavior. And so it's incredibly useful and important for us to be able to use surveys to gather that sort of information. Now, this makes it easy to collect large amounts of data. Again, very useful for our purposes. But there are a few problems. First is that participation in surveys is beginning to decline, and there's probably a lot of things going on there. That's a function of a more jaded society, of a more self-centered society, and a greater unwillingness to help others. The other thing is that data from surveys really relies on people to self-report, and that sort of data isn't always accurate. So we really need to make sure we have a very large sample size, because if you have a small sample size and you have 2 or 3 people who are not accurately self-reporting, it can throw everything off. So being just aware of the potential drawbacks to make sure that you get a proper sample size and you get a proper representation, that you're getting the right types of people to represent the general public or that group that you want to have. So surveys are useful, but be cautious with them. We're going to talk now a little bit about the statistics in psychology. And in psychology, there's kind of two major branches of statistics. The first is descriptive statistics, which the purpose of descriptive statistics is just simply to gather and organize data. That's it. Just collect the data and organize it in a way that makes it easy to kind of understand what's going on and easy for people to read and understand. The second is inferential statistics, and inferential statistics is the process of analyzing that data that you have in order to draw conclusions and extrapolate that to larger concepts or larger ideas. So inferential statistics analyzes data, descriptive statistics just gathers it for us. Another term in statistics that's important to know is variability, which references the idea of variability is how much the numbers in a data set differ from one another. So, what is you may have numbers from 50 to 100, or you may have numbers from 1 to 20. That's just variabilities. How much do numbers in a data set differ? And one way to measure data is a variability is something called standard deviation. And standard deviation just represents, we talked about it in class, but it represents how far away from the mean certain groups are. So there you go. And standard deviation is subject to change depending on the data set. So when data is more spread out, that is, if you had sample sizes or responses that range from 50 to 150, let's say we're talking about how much weight can you lift, right? And if you had someone who responded 50 and someone who responded 150, that standard deviation is going to be significantly larger than if you ask the same thing and your data responder said from 95 to 105, right? So the more spread out they are, the more variable they are, the larger the standard deviation will be. Some other information about statistics is there's a term called the correlational coefficient. And the correlational coefficient is a number value that represents the degree and direction of the relationship between two variables. So that is how strong of a relationship do they have, and how positive and if that relationship is positive or negative. And so a positive correlation indicates that as the attribute X increases, so does the attribute Y. So that one example that I've seen used often is there's a positive correlation between high school GPA and college GPA. That is, if you have a high school GPA, you tend to have a higher college GPA, right? So as X increases, so does Y. A negative correlation could indicate as the value of X increases, Y decreases. So that could be, for example, there's a negative correlation between smoking and lifespan. The more you smoke, the value of X goes up. The shorter you live, the value of Y decreases. So that is the way we measure it, positive and negative. If there's a positive relationship between the two, both increase. If there's a negative, one increases and one decreases. Think of it as charting it on a graph, the X and the Y axis. And so the correlational coefficient ranges from -1 to 1. And -1 is obviously the negative correlation, and 1 is positive correlation, and so they're measured in values within that range, just to keep it standard, if you will. So a negative relationship of 0.9 is really strong and significantly stronger than a negative relationship of -0.1, right? And then a positive relationship of 0.95 is significantly stronger than a positive relationship of 0.15. So you've got that correlational coefficient. The last thing we'll look at is something called statistical significance. And statistical significance is said to exist when the probability that your findings in your survey or research is due to chance are low. Sometimes this is referred to the p-value. So you may see the p-value and know that that means statistical significance. And the generally accepted level of statistical significance is 0.05. So anything that's the p-value is less than 0.05 means that it's very unlikely that what occurred happened due to chance. And the reason why this is significant is because it helps us avoid type 1 errors. There's two types of errors in psychology statistics. Type 1 is when we claim a conclusion that shows that there is a difference or a relationship when really that doesn't exist. And that's a real problem. So if we see a relationship because of chance, that's why we want to avoid that. And that's why we have statistical significance. Type 2 errors exist when the conclusion is drawn that there is no difference when there really is in fact a difference. So we have to be careful of those two types of errors. Statistical significance helps us avoid type 1 errors, which are kind of the most dangerous because it can create preconceived notions, and type 2 can be more easily dispelled. So that's just a brief overview of kind of the concepts of correlational research and then the statistics that goes along with it.